Hello, Dean Revell and Bruce Maynard here with a short presentation on the use of guidance tracks at water points. There's another set of examples of the tools available to you in self-herding and self-shepherding. But first, some general comments around tracks and guidance fences because they can be used for multiple purposes. We can lead animals to areas or indeed away from areas. When animals have become familiar with using guidance tracks or walking along a guidance fence, then it creates some applications that could be very useful. For example, adapting animals to travelling in a predictable direction as part of the mustering process. For example, you may trigger the movement, but when animals are taken to a guidance track or to a guidance fence, they are likely to continue moving along those. We could also use tracks and guidance fences to spread the impacts of animal movement and grazing from areas of current use to areas of relative underutilisation. And think also how it could be used for animal discovery, particularly with predators, because they too will learn to make use of the guidance tracks and move along guidance fences, allowing you the opportunity to learn more about the number and type of animals in that area. And for example, you could place a motion detection trap camera at one or both ends of a relatively short guidance track or guidance fence and learn quite a lot about the animals that are out there and shape your management responses accordingly. So in essence, guidance tracks can work to spread the grazing and occupation into areas that would otherwise not be utilised. And quite simply, it is to make it easier for animals to access those targeted areas by providing direct paths for them into those areas. So these set of examples are for using guidance tracks at water points, and in this case it's guidance tracks for the human movement rather than directly on the animal movement. In other examples, in other presentations, the use of the tracks and fences will be to shape the animal movement more directly. The tracks are positioned so that when you go about your normal business of accessing and inspecting water points, you also de-stress the animals on each approach. And that de-stressing is achieved by parallel movements. We'll show you some examples of that shortly. So the design and use of these guidance tracks determine the human movement, the aspect of that movement and the direction. That has an effect on the seen animals and animals that you may not see. For more information around stress-free stockmanship and the impact of paralleling, have a look at Bruce's website stressfreestockmanship.com.au or contact us directly for more information. So in this example, the guidance tracks are set up if you are accessing them from the same direction every time, in this case from right to left on the screen. So in the first case, there's a double leg guidance track which take the human past the water once, past the water a second time before the direct access into the water. In the second example, a single leg where the human passes the water point once before the approach into the water. Now you can imagine more complex designs with multiple legged approaches. That's all fine and may be beneficial for the animals, and we'll show you an example shortly where that may be the case, but generally a single or double leg approach will be sufficient for you to get the sort of responses that will make it worthwhile. Now if you approach water points from either direction, then you will need a slightly different design where a double entry is required. So as you could see from those animations, if you're approaching from the left to right, you pass the water once, twice, and then in. And just the same, if you're approaching from the right, you pass the water once, come back twice before in. So on each occasion, the animals are experiencing two parallel movements before your access to the water point. Now, I mentioned that a slightly more complex design could be useful. For example, if you seldom visit a particular water point and want to create more opportunities for paralleling and de-stressing of the animals on those visits, or where there's a higher number of clean skins and increased numbers of parallel movements would be beneficial for reducing their stress and reducing their movement so they don't scatter on each occasion that you visit the water point. So here is showing you a square set of guidance tracks that allow the human to pass the water point once, second parallel, third, fourth and fifth. And indeed, if you saw benefit and had time for increasing the number of parallel movements, then you can just work your way around that square multiple times if you so wish. The final comment to bear in mind is that we're constructing these tracks not only to influence the animals that are at the water point and are visible to us, so this little animation, which I'll show you again, as we approach along a guidance track, our pressure zone is represented by those green shapes, and these animals that come under the influence of our pressure will clearly have a response to us, but so too will these animals that are further afield, because they will see, hear and observe and respond to what's happening, both as a consequence of our movement, but also the responses of the animals that are directly impacted by us. So we can have very positive effects not only on the animals in the immediate vicinity, but those that are just a little further afield that will learn very quickly that the approach of the human is predictable and without negative consequence. We hope you found this useful and can imagine it having relevance at your place. We'll talk to you again on some other videos around guidance tracks and their application. Until then, all the best. Bye for now.